The autumn rain hammered against the windows of Luke Mitchell's corner office, matching the turbulent thoughts racing through his mind. He stared at the email on his screen, reading it for the fifth time, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the edge of his desk. The message from their potential investor, Harrison Group, mentioned a meeting that had apparently taken place 3 weeks ago, a meeting he knew nothing about. Luke leaned back in his chair, running his fingers through his graying hair. At 45, he'd thought he was past the point of being naive in business. He and Kevin had built Mitchell and Walsh Technologies from nothing over the past 5 years, turning their shared vision of innovative supply chain solutions into a growing reality. They'd been more than just business partners, they'd been friends who spent holidays together, whose families knew each other, who trusted each other implicitly. Or so he'd thought. The sound of heels clicking on hardwood made him look up. His wife Sophie stood in the doorway, her banker's attire as impeccable as always, though her expression carried an unusual weight. "You're still here," she said, more statement than question. "I thought I might find you burning the midnight oil." "Something's not adding up," Luke replied, gesturing for her to come in. He watched as she crossed the room, noting how she seemed to hesitate before sitting down. "Kevin's been having meetings I don't know about. Big ones." Sophie's perfectly manicured fingers played with the pearl necklace he'd given her for their 15th anniversary. "The Harrison Group meeting?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. When Luke's head snapped up, she added, "There are whispers at the bank. Things I've been hearing that didn't make sense until now." "What kinds of whispers?" Luke demanded, leaning forward. The rain intensified outside, creating a dramatic backdrop to their conversation. "Luke." Sophie paused, choosing her words carefully. "The Harrison Group isn't just looking to invest. They're looking to acquire, and the numbers being discussed, they're not adding up to what's in your company's official records." The implications hit Luke like a physical blow. He stood up, pacing the length of his office. "Kevin's been cooking the books. That's impossible. We have regular audits, everything's transparent." But even as he said it, memories began surfacing, Kevin's increasing secretiveness, the new offshore accounts he'd insisted were for tax efficiency, the way he'd been slowly taking over relationships with their biggest clients. "There's more," Sophie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Remember that new client from last month, Meridian Systems? I processed some of their paperwork today. The company was incorporated just 3 months ago, and its primary shareholder is listed as Kevin Walsh, through a shell corporation." Luke felt the blood drain from his face. Meridian Systems had signed a contract worth millions, with terms that were suspiciously favorable to them. At the time, Kevin had insisted it was necessary to break into a new market segment. Now, Luke realized, it had been nothing more than an elaborate scheme to funnel money out of their company. "I need proof," Luke said, his voice hardening. "Hard evidence that I can take to the board." Sophie stood up, straightening her blazer. "Be careful, Luke. Kevin's smart, and he's had time to cover his tracks. Plus." She hesitated again, "I've seen his name coming up in connection with some people you don't want to mess with. Promise me you'll be discreet about this." Luke nodded, but his mind was already racing ahead, plotting his next moves. He'd need to access the secure server where their most sensitive financial documents were stored, but Kevin had changed the security protocols last month, citing cybersecurity concerns. He'd have to find another way in. As Sophie turned to leave, she paused at the door. "Luke, whatever you find, don't confront him alone. Kevin's not the same person we used to have dinner parties with. Something's changed in him." After she left, Luke stood at his office window, watching the city lights blur through the rain-streaked glass. In the reflection, he could see his own face, the lines of stress around his eyes, the set of his jaw that Sophie always said meant he was about to do something either brilliant or foolish. Tonight, he wasn't sure which it would be. His phone buzzed with a text from Kevin, "Drinks tomorrow? Need to discuss some exciting developments." Luke stared at the message, his finger hovering over the reply button. Finally, he typed, "Wouldn't miss it." The words felt like ash in his mouth, but he hit send anyway. Tomorrow, he'd play the role of the unsuspecting partner one last time. But tonight he had some digging to do. Opening his laptop, he began the painstaking process of piecing together the truth about his partner's betrayal, unaware that this was just the beginning of a chain of events that would test not only his business acumen but every relationship he held dear. The bar's ambient lighting couldn't mask the cold calculation in Kevin's eyes as he raised his glass in a mock toast. "To our future success," he said, flashing that trademark smile that had charmed countless investors. Luke forced himself to smile back, though his stomach churned with the knowledge of what he'd discovered in the early hours of the morning. He'd spent hours combing through old server backups, following a trail that Kevin had tried to obscure. The evidence was devastating: falsified profit projections, hidden accounts, and a complex web of shell companies all leading back to Kevin's private holding company in the Cayman Islands. But what truly made Luke's blood run cold was the discovery that Kevin had been systematically transferring their intellectual property rights to his own name through a series of seemingly routine legal documents. "So, about those developments," Kevin continued, setting down his whiskey. "Harrison Group is ready to move forward. They're offering $300 million. He paused, studying Luke's face. "Of course, that's contingent on both of us staying on board for at least 2 years post-acquisition." Luke took a slow sip of his drink, buying time. "Interesting. Especially since their original offer was for $500 million. He watched as Kevin's smile flickered almost imperceptibly. "But then, that was before you restructured our IP holdings, wasn't it?" The temperature between them seemed to drop 10 degrees. Kevin's facade cracked for just a moment, revealing something dark and unfamiliar beneath. "You've been digging," he said softly. "That's not very trusting of you, partner." "Partner?" Luke laughed bitterly. "Is that what you call someone you're systematically stealing from?" He pulled out his phone, pulling up the documents he'd discovered. "Meridian Systems, Kevin. Really? Did you think I wouldn't figure out it was your shell company?" Kevin's response was not what Luke expected. Instead of denying it, he leaned back, completely at ease. "You know what your problem is, Luke? You think too small. Always have. This company could be 10 times what it is, but you're always worried about ethics, about doing things the right way." He spat out the last words like they were poison. "Do you know how much money we've left on the table because of your moral compass?" "Our company was built on trust," Luke shot back. "Our clients trust us with their data, their operations dash." "Our clients are sheep," Kevin cut in. "And sheep get sheared. I've just found a more efficient way to do it." He pulled out his own phone, tapping briefly before sliding it across the table. "Take a look." Luke's heart nearly stopped. On the screen was a bank statement showing their company's main operating account. The balance was zero. All their working capital, gone. "Transferred about an hour ago," Kevin said casually. "Don't worry, it's safe. Just not accessible to you anymore." His voice hardened. "Here's how this is going to work. You're going to sign over your voting rights to me, take a nice golden parachute, and walk away. Otherwise..." He shrugged. "Well, let's just say our clients might be interested to know how their sensitive data has been mishandled under your leadership." "You wouldn't dare," Luke growled. "That would destroy the company." "Better destroyed than in your hands," Kevin replied. "You have until tomorrow morning to decide." "Oh, and Luke." His smile turned predatory. "Don't bother trying to call an emergency board meeting. I've already spoken to them." Funny how persuasive people can be when their own financial interests are at stake. Luke stood up so abruptly his chair scraped loudly against the floor, drawing looks from nearby patrons. "This isn't over," he said, his voice shaking with rage. "Actually, it is," Kevin replied, raising his glass again. You just don't know it yet. The drive home was a blur. Luke's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He'd known Kevin was betraying him, but this was something else entirely. This wasn't just business anymore, this was personal. When he walked through his front door, Sophie was waiting up for him, her face pale with worry. Luke. What happened? He told her everything, watching as her expression shifted from concern to shock to cold anger. When he finished, she was silent for a long moment, then said something that made him look at her with new eyes. Kevin's good, she said, her banker's mind clearly racing. But he's made one crucial mistake. He thinks he's only fighting you. A slow, dangerous smile spread across her face. He has no idea what I can do. Looking at his wife's expression, Luke felt the first stirring of hope. Kevin might have the money and the board, but Sophie had secrets of her own. And as Luke was about to discover, she'd been preparing for this fight longer than he knew. Sophie's home office was a monument to organized chaos. Papers covered every surface, sticky notes created a colorful mosaic on her walls, and her 3 monitors displayed different financial records. Luke watched in amazement as his wife, still in her silk pajamas at 3 a.m., worked with an intensity he'd never seen before. Kevin's clever, but he's arrogant, Sophie said, not looking up from her keyboard. He's been so focused on covering his tracks with the big transactions that he's overlooked the small ones. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. Look at this. Luke leaned in, squinting at the screen. Transaction records scrolled past, hundreds of them, all small enough to fly under regulatory radar. What am I looking at? Patterns, Sophie replied, her voice taking on the sharp edge he recognized from when she was closing in on something. Every fraudster has patterns. Kevin's been moving money through a network of shell companies, but he always uses the same intermediary banks. And guess which bank handles 60% of these transactions? Yours, Luke breathed, beginning to understand. Mine. Sophie's smile was fierce. And as head of compliance review, I have access to every single transaction record. She pulled up another screen. But here's where it gets interesting. Remember James Chen? Luke frowned. The client who backed out of our Singapore expansion last year. Kevin said he got cold feet. James never backed out, Sophie said quietly. The deal was done. The papers were signed. But the money was diverted. She pointed to a series of transactions. Kevin used our company's credentials to redirect the funds through a series of offshore accounts. James thought he was paying Mitchell and Walsh Technologies. Instead, he was unknowingly funding Kevin's private ventures. Luke felt sick. James was going to be our breakthrough into the Asian market. When that fell through, you had to lay off 20 people, Sophie finished. And Kevin used that setback to convince the board that the company needed his aggressive new direction. She turned to face him fully. But James wasn't the only one. I've found similar patterns with at least 6 other major clients. Luke paced the room, his mind racing. We need to get this information to the board. Not yet, Sophie cautioned. Kevin's got them convinced you're the problem. We need more than just transaction records. We need. She trailed off, her eyes widening. The audit. What audit? The one that's supposed to start next week. Kevin doesn't know, but I had lunch with Sarah from the auditing firm last month. She mentioned they're sending their new forensic team. Sophie's expression turned calculating. A team that specializes in detecting exactly the kind of fraud Kevin's been committing. Luke sat down heavily in the spare chair. He'll find a way to stop it. No, Sophie said with quiet certainty. He won't. Because he doesn't know it's coming. The audit was scheduled months ago, before he started getting sloppy. And canceling it now would raise too many red flags. She reached for her phone. But we need allies. People who've been hurt by Kevin's schemes but don't know it yet. Over the next few hours, they built their coalition. Sophie made calls to former clients, carefully planting seeds of doubt about their transactions. Luke reached out to old employees who'd been laid off after the Singapore debacle, discovering that many had suspected something was wrong but hadn't known who to trust. As dawn broke, casting long shadows across the paper-strewn room, Luke felt a mix of hope and dread. They had a plan now, but also a terrible vulnerability. If Kevin discovered what they were doing before everything was in place. He's going to notice I haven't signed the voting rights transfer, Luke said suddenly. He'll know something's wrong. Sophie stood up, stretching tired muscles. Let him. In fact. A slow smile spread across her face. I think it's time we gave him something to worry about. Do you still have access to the company's PR system? Yes, but what are you thinking? I'm thinking it's time to announce that Mitchell & Walsh Technologies is hosting a special investor meeting. One where we'll be discussing some exciting new developments about our financial structure. She met his eyes. Kevin's not the only one who can play games with the board. Luke felt a chill run down his spine. He'll see it as a declaration of war. Good, Sophie said, her voice hard. Because that's exactly what it is. As they finally headed downstairs for coffee, Luke caught Sophie's arm. Why are you doing all this? This isn't your fight. Sophie turned to him, her expression fierce. The day I married you, I promised to stand by you through better or worse. But more than that. Her eyes flashed. Kevin didn't just betray you. He betrayed everything we believe in. And I've spent my entire career catching men like him who think they're too clever to get caught. Looking at his wife, Luke realized something that Kevin had fatally overlooked. In focusing on Luke as his opponent, Kevin had ignored the real threat, the quiet, brilliant woman who'd spent years building the very systems he was now abusing. And as the sun rose over their suburban home, Luke knew that the real battle was just beginning. The investor meeting announcement hit like a bomb in the financial community. Luke stood at his office window, watching news vans gather outside the building while his phone exploded with messages from board members, clients, and reporters. But the one person he hadn't heard from was Kevin, and that silence was deafening. Mr. Mitchell. His assistant's voice crackled over the intercom. The IT department is reporting some unusual activity on our servers. They're asking for authorization to dash. The intercom went dead. Then the lights flickered and died. His computer screen went black. Luke's blood ran cold. He grabbed his phone to call Sophie, but there was no signal. Running to his office door, he found it wouldn't open, the electronic lock was dead. Through the glass walls, he could see other employees discovering the same thing. The entire floor was in lockdown. His office phone rang, the old landline that nobody ever used. With trembling fingers, he picked it up. Amazing how vulnerable modern businesses are to technical difficulties, Kevin's voice was smooth as silk. One small glitch in the security system, and everything just stops. What have you done? Luke demanded. Me? I'm just a concerned business partner watching our company's systems suffer an unfortunate cyber attack. Of course, all our sensitive client data is being copied to external servers as we speak. Tragic, really. But these things happen when a company's leadership becomes unstable. Luke's mind raced. The backup servers. The client data. Everything they'd built over years of trust, Kevin was going to destroy it all. This won't just hurt me, Kevin. You'll go down too. Will I? Kevin chuckled. Check your email. Oh wait, you can't. But when you do, you'll find some very interesting documents showing how you've been selling client data on the dark web. Complete with your digital signature. The timestamps go back months. The implications hit Luke like a physical blow. Kevin hadn't just been stealing, he'd been building a paper trail to frame him. Nobody will believe it. The beauty of modern technology is that everybody believes what the data tells them. And the data will tell a very compelling story about your mental breakdown and desperate attempts to save your failing marriage by embezzling company funds. Through his office windows, Luke could see police cars arriving. His phone suddenly buzzed with a text from Sophie, "Don't react. Kevin watching. Trust me." "Still there, Luke?" Kevin's voice dripped with false concern. "You should see what's happening to our stock price right now. Amazing how quickly the market reacts to a cybersecurity breach. Especially when anonymous sources suggest it might be an inside job." Luke forced himself to remain calm, remembering Sophie's warning. "You won't get away with this. I already have. The board is convening an emergency meeting in 1 hour. Given the circumstances, they'll have no choice but to suspend you pending investigation. Which means all your access codes, all your authority, everything, gone." Kevin paused. Unless what? Sign over your voting rights now. Walk away with a generous settlement. I'll even make sure Sophie keeps her job at the bank. After all, it would be terrible if evidence of insider trading started appearing in her transaction records too. The threat against Sophie made Luke's vision go red. But before he could respond, his phone buzzed again, "Servers secure. Stay calm." Playing his game. "Time's running out, Luke," Kevin continued. "The board meeting starts at noon. Once they vote to suspend you, there's no turning back. And believe me, they will vote to suspend you. I've made sure of that." Through the glass walls, Luke could see tech teams rushing through the office, trying to restore systems. Security guards were evacuating employees. In the distance, sirens wailed. "You have 30 minutes to make your decision," Kevin said. "I'm sending over the papers now. A courier will be waiting in the lobby. Sign them, and this all goes away. Don't sign them." He left the threat hanging. The line went dead. Luke stood in his darkened office, surrounded by chaos, feeling the walls closing in. Everything he'd built was crumbling around him. His reputation, his company, his future, all balanced on a knife's edge. His phone buzzed one final time. A message from Sophie, "Get ready. The real game starts now." Looking out at the media circus below, Luke realized this was Kevin's endgame, a public execution of his reputation, broadcast live on every business channel. But Sophie's messages suggested she had seen this coming. Had prepared for it. The question was, what did she know that Kevin didn't? And more importantly, would they be able to use it before Kevin's carefully orchestrated destruction was complete? The next hour would determine not just the fate of his company, but whether Luke Mitchell would end the day as a respected businessman or be led out in handcuffs, branded as a criminal who betrayed everything he claimed to believe in. Sophie's heels echoed through the marble lobby of First National Bank as she strode past security, her expression giving no hint of the storm about to break. Behind her walked Sarah Chen, head of forensic accounting, and James Chen, their former Singapore client. Both carried thick folders and wore expressions of grim determination. "Ms. Walsh," the young security guard called out, hurrying to catch up. Mr. Kevin Walsh left strict instructions not to allow anyone into the boardroom without his explicit approval. Sophie turned, fixing him with a stern look. "That's Mrs. Mitchell," she corrected coldly. "And as head of compliance for this bank, I don't need anyone's approval to investigate potential financial crimes." She held up her security badge. "Now, unless you want to explain to the Federal Reserve why you obstructed a banking oversight investigation, I suggest you step aside." The guard paled and stepped back. Sophie led her team toward the elevators, her mind racing through the final details of their plan. The past 3 weeks hadn't been just about gathering evidence, they'd been about positioning pieces on a chessboard that Kevin didn't even know existed. Her phone buzzed. A message from Luke, Kevin's courier in lobby with papers. Board assembling now. Police still here. Perfect timing, she murmured, then turned to Sarah. You have everything? The forensic accountant nodded, patting her briefcase. Every transaction, every shell company, every falsified document. 3 years of Kevin's financial manipulation laid bare. He was clever, but he got sloppy with the internal bank routing codes. He never thought anyone would look that closely, James added grimly. After all, who questions successful transactions? But when Sophie showed me where my investment actually went. His face darkened. My lawyers are ready to file criminal charges. The elevator opened directly into the executive floor. Through the glass walls, they could see the board members assembling, their faces tense. Kevin stood at the head of the table, looking impeccable in his designer suit as he distributed documents with an air of somber concern. Remember, Sophie whispered to her team, timing is everything. Wait for my signal. Inside the boardroom, Kevin was speaking. Regrettable situation, but the evidence is clear. Luke Mitchell has betrayed this company's trust and must be removed immediately. The documents before you show dash. Actually, Sophie's voice cut through the room as she pushed open the doors, the documents before you show something quite different. She nodded to Sarah, who began distributing new folders to the stunned board members. Kevin's facade cracked for just a moment. This is a private board meeting. Security. Oh, we've already dealt with security, Sophie said smoothly. They're quite interested in the evidence of money laundering we've uncovered. Particularly the transactions involving certain numbered accounts in the Cayman Islands. The board members were flipping through the new documents, their expressions shifting from confusion to shock. Kevin took a step toward Sophie, but James' chin moved to block his path. Remember me, Kevin? James asked quietly. The investor you thought you'd fooled? Sophie showed me exactly where my money went. Every shell company, every fake transaction, every lie. These allegations are ridiculous, Kevin sputtered, but his eyes darted toward the door. This is clearly a desperate attempt by Luke's wife to dash. To what? Sophie interrupted, her voice razor-sharp. To expose how you've been stealing from this company for years. To reveal how you've been manipulating client funds. Or perhaps. She pulled out one final document. To show the board how you've been blackmailing them with manufactured evidence of their own supposed misconduct. The room went deathly silent. Board members exchanged alarmed looks as they realized the full scope of Kevin's manipulation. Sophie watched as their fear turned to anger. Mrs. Mitchell, the board chairman said slowly, are you saying you have proof of all this? Better than proof, Sophie replied, nodding to Sarah. We have the entire paper trail. Every transaction, every fake document, every piece of blackmail material Kevin created. And most importantly. She smiled coldly at Kevin. We have his mistakes. Kevin lunged for the door, but 2 FBI agents stepped in to block his path. Sophie felt a grim satisfaction as she watched the color drain from his face. The game was over, but the final move had yet to be played. As Kevin was led away in handcuffs, Sophie's phone buzzed one last time. A message from Luke, power restored. Systems back online. Client data secure. She allowed herself a small smile. Kevin had been so focused on the big picture, the dramatic takedown, the public humiliation, the hostile takeover, that he'd missed the real threat. While he'd been playing checkers, Sophie had been playing chess, using her position at the bank to quietly build an irrefutable case against him. But as she watched the board members huddled in shocked discussion, Sophie knew their victory wasn't complete yet. There was still one more card to play, one that would not only save the company but transform it into something stronger than ever. And as she prepared to reveal her final surprise, Sophie couldn't help but think how Kevin's greatest mistake hadn't been his greed or his arrogance. It had been underestimating the quiet banker who had spent her career learning exactly how men like him thought they could get away with anything. 1 year later, Luke stood at the same window where this had all begun, but everything else had changed. The evening sun cast long shadows across the city skyline, glinting off the new company logo that now adorned the building, Mitchell Technologies and Financial Security Solutions. Behind him, the boardroom buzzed with excitement as investors filed in for their annual meeting. The company's stock had not just recovered from Kevin's attempted destruction, it had soared to new heights, fueled by their expanded focus on fraud prevention and financial security systems. "Ready for your speech?" Sophie appeared at his side, looking elegant in her new role as Chief Compliance Officer. The position had been created specifically for her after the board realized how her banking expertise had saved the company. "Almost," Luke replied, adjusting his tie. "Still feels surreal sometimes. A year ago today, I thought I was going to lose everything. Instead, you built something stronger." Sophie smiled, handing him a newspaper. The headline read, "Walsh sentenced, former tech executive gets 15 years for fraud." Luke skimmed the article, noting how Kevin had finally pleaded guilty to all charges. The evidence Sophie had gathered had been overwhelming, revealing a pattern of fraud that stretched back years before he'd even partnered with Luke. "Mr. Mitchell." His assistant appeared at the door. "They're ready for you." Walking into the packed boardroom, Luke felt a surge of pride. The faces looking back at him weren't just investors, they were partners in something revolutionary. James Chen, now heading their Asian division, nodded from his seat. Sarah Chen, who had left her accounting firm to become their head of forensic technology, gave him a thumbs up. A year ago, Luke began, his voice strong and clear, "This company faced its darkest hour. We were betrayed by someone we trusted, nearly destroyed by greed and deception." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But in that crisis, we discovered something extraordinary. We discovered that our greatest strength wasn't in our technology or our market position, it was in our commitment to integrity." The room was silent, hanging on his words. Through the windows, the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Kevin Walsh thought he could exploit the system because he understood its weaknesses. What he failed to understand was that those same weaknesses could be turned into strengths. Every method he used to deceive us became a blueprint for prevention. Every fraud technique he employed showed us exactly what our clients needed protection against. Luke gestured to the screens behind him, where their latest financial results were displayed. "Our new security systems, built on the very vulnerabilities Kevin exposed, are now protecting over 300 financial institutions worldwide. Our fraud detection algorithms, developed from studying his methods, have prevented over $2 billion in potential losses this year alone." The room erupted in applause. Luke waited for it to quiet before continuing, his voice softening. "But the real victory isn't in the numbers. It's in what we proved about the power of trust and integrity. Every client who stood by us, every employee who worked through those dark days, every investor who believed in our vision, you proved that doing things the right way isn't just morally correct, it's good business." As he concluded his speech to a standing ovation, Luke caught Sophie's eye across the room. In that moment, he remembered their late-night conversations, the moments of doubt, the times when giving up seemed like the only option. But Sophie had never wavered, never lost faith in him or their shared values. Later that evening, as they walked to their car under a star-filled sky, Sophie slipped her hand into his. "Penny for your thoughts." "I was just thinking about something Kevin said that night at the bar," Luke replied. "About how my moral compass was holding the company back. He never understood that integrity isn't a limitation, it's a foundation." Sophie squeezed his hand. He saw the world as a zero-sum game. Everything was about winning at someone else's expense. And look where that got him. Luke shook his head. 15 years in federal prison, everything he built turned to ash. They reached their car, but neither made a move to get in, enjoying the peaceful evening. In the distance, their building's new logo glowed against the night sky, a beacon of what they'd built from the ashes of betrayal. You know what the real irony is? Sophie said softly. If Kevin had just been honest, if he'd put his brilliant mind to work solving problems instead of creating them, he could have had everything he wanted. Success, respect, wealth, it was all there for the taking. Luke turned to face his wife, the woman who had not just stood by him but had fought for him with a fierce intelligence that still amazed him. I got something better, he said. I got the truth about who I could really trust. And I got to build something that actually matters. As they drove home through the quiet streets, Luke realized that Kevin's betrayal, painful as it had been, had given them an unexpected gift. It had shown them not just who they could trust, but who they were when everything was on the line. And in the end, that knowledge was worth more than all the money Kevin had tried to steal. The company wasn't just surviving anymore, it was thriving, built on a foundation of trust that no amount of deception could ever shake. And as Luke looked at Sophie, he knew that some victories weren't measured in dollars and cents, but in the strength of the bonds that emerged stronger from the fire of adversity.